No surprise, I suppose, that in with China in the background, that there is some sort of relationship between North Korea and Russia.
Well, yes, but what's really happening here is the change in that relationship because Russia is looking for friends, and in particular, it's looking for friends that can fuel its war against Ukraine. That's why everybody is so concerned about this meeting because each of these two sides has something that they want from the other. So it's a match made in hell. Russia wants North Korean ammunition to carry on pummeling Ukraine at the other end of the country, those 7 time zones away that you just mentioned. And North Korea wants support, whether it's in developing its own weapons technology to throw its weight around, or in its own region, or just energy and food supplies to try to keep its economy afloat. So, whichever way you look at it, if this meeting is successful for the two people involved, it's bad news for absolutely everybody else.
Now, North Korea obviously is constantly threatening to be a nuclear power, but there is a certain knock on North Korea that it's quite shonky when it comes to some of its defense organizations, some of its militarization. How good a quality ammunition, how good quality weaponry can they provide to Russia?
Well, what's being looked at here in terms of what Russia needs and the gap that North Korea can fill is fairly low tech, because to some extent, what's been happening in Ukraine is as a battle between artillery and old school artillery. Russia's actually had to change its tactics because it could no longer burn through the thousands and millions of artillery shells that it used to use for blanket saturation of an area in its old school doctrine and its old school tactics. So it's had to adapt. And of course, if it goes back to its own comfort zone of having all the shells in the world to throw at the Ukrainians, it'll be far happier. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a high tech flow
Okay.
in both directions.
So actually, Russia wants an old school war, and in that sense, North Korea might be able to help them.
Russia has been adapting. It's been changing the way it fights in response to learning on the battlefield in Ukraine in exactly the same way as the Ukrainians have. But there's still a certain pull back to the old-fashioned way of doing things that you can see displayed sometimes when Russia has the opportunity to default back to how it always used to fight.
What about this question? It's been a long debate in Russian history about whether it faces west or east, and clearly the enmity between Russia and the West is very, very marked. Is this move to talk to Kim Jong Un to have a closer relationship with North Korea symptomatic of a broader policy position, which is that Russia is going to be increasingly looking east?
Russia would certainly like us to think that, of course, it's looking east because the future is in the east. In fact, it's more a sign of desperation. It's Russia looking around to try to build a coalition of rogue states that will support it. And again, it comes back to this: the reason why this meeting is treated as so important, and the reason why we first heard about it, not from the Russians or the North Koreans, but the Americans. It's the only people that can be happy about this are the people who want to burn the world down.
Is China a rogue state in that regard? I mean, it's a very live debate in Britain at the moment about whether it's a threat or a challenge. We talk about Chinese spying at the heart of government, but it does raise this question, doesn't it, about the role of China in this type of geopolitical debate. I mean, China is Russia's ally. To what extent? To what extent it brokers a deal between Russia and North Korea? It seems to be an interesting question.
It doesn't seem to have been necessary for China to step in, at least
Really?
overtly, in setting this up, because again, Russia is so desperate. But of course, China has the luxury of being able to sit back and watch how this contest between Russia and Ukraine backed by the West, actually plays out, because it can see who comes out on top and then pick up the pieces later. China doesn't actually have to throw its weight in on either side of these. There are lots of persistent rumors and persistent reporting that it has been supporting Russia to some extent, and there does seem to be some indication that it is providing some kind of war material to Russia, but it doesn't actually need to pick a side at this point.
I wonder if one of the lessons of the G20, Keir, is that Russia has to, obviously, you've got to say it's got to search desperately for allies, but you can start drawing up large swathes of the world where Russia is not necessarily a pariah. It might not be an ally, but it's not necessarily a pariah. I wonder what that means for the future. You know, we had that G20 statement earlier in the week where effectively the G20 nations weren't that condemnatory towards Russia, presumably because many African nations aren't that critical. India isn't that critical. China's not that critical. You can start building up a list of quite large, substantial parts of the world that is not as hostile to Russia because of its activities in Ukraine as, say, Britain and America is.
It's true. And it depends how you cut the numbers. You can look at it in a way that it is actually still a minority of states that doesn't disapprove of Russian genocidal aggression in Ukraine, or you can actually build a coalition by looking at those numbers of countries that simply haven't said anything about it. Of course, it's a huge victory for Russian information operations and influence over the previous years that you've got countries in Africa that were threatened with near starvation as a result of Russian grain blockade, but they still weren't actually pointing to Russia as the cause of their problems. So we have to bear in mind also the economic interest and the leadership interest of these countries. It doesn't necessarily mean that they like Russia if they don't speak out against it.
Just finally, we had Joe Biden in Vietnam yesterday. I think there is some whisper. I don't know how much you know about this, of Russia getting the deal, an arms deal with Vietnam.
That is the first I've heard of that.
Really? Well, maybe it's not sure. New York Times reported a couple of days ago. Vietnam chased secret deal, Russian arms deal, even as it deepens U.S. ties. But it just goes to the point that there's lots of balls in play at the moment, aren't there, for Russia, and where it finds its allies, or at least people who are still willing to do business with it.
That's exactly right. And of course, it's not just Russia. There are other countries that are casting around the world looking for supplies of munitions. In our case, in the UK's case, it's because we are trying to back Ukraine against the aggression, but still looking for sources of munitions and weapons wherever we can find them to actually throw them into the fight. And that just speaks to the fact that across Europe, countries haven't really woken up to the fact that we are already involved in this war and restructured their defense industries accordingly. We're still going around the world cap in hand in a similar way to Russia is, looking for anything to actually keep Ukraine afloat.